The reason I'm called the ransomware sommelier is a mistake that CNN made. A good friend of mine, Sean Lingus, is a reporter for CNN, and he quoted me in an article about a ransomware attack many years ago. And he couldn't remember my title. So he put in the article ransomware connoisseur as a placeholder till he could come up with the right title. Then he forgot to ask, and his editor didn't notice. So I went out in the article as the ransomware connoisseur, and I joked with him that I'm more of a ransomware sommelier because I can help pair the right ransomware with the vulnerabilities in your network. So like a good restaurant sommelier can tell you what wine goes best with the steak you're eating, I can tell you what ransomware you're going to get based on what you haven't done in your network. So my name's Alan Liska. I am a ransomware researcher at Recorded Future, and we're going to talk about the ransomware threat and the resilience imperative. And I really like the way I was introduced, because one of the things that I hear about a lot now when I talk to executives and leaders at companies is they are tired of hearing about ransomware. There's a term in our industry that's gained a lot of traction called ransomware fatigue. Everybody is sick of hearing about ransomware. I started researching ransomware when I worked at FireEye 12 years ago, and I've been doing it ever since. So if y'all think you're sick of hearing about ransomware, I am very sick of talking about ransomware. The problem is, like he said, it's not going anywhere. Ransomware attacks are as prevalent as ever. This year, there have been more than 19 law enforcement actions against ransomware actors. That includes arrests, that includes sanctions. They've gone after the initial access brokers, they've gone after ransomware operators who don't live in Russia, and they've gone after the cryptocurrency exchanges that the ransomware actors use to launder their money. Despite the fact that we've seen more law enforcement actions this year than in any other given 9-month period since I've been researching ransomware, ransomware attacks are still about even with where they were in 2023. So we're seeing maybe a bit of a depressive effect in that they haven't gone up even more, but we're not seeing a reduction in the number of ransomware attacks. Ransomware attacks just aren't going anywhere. And so you have to plan for the fact that you're probably going to get hit, or one of your partners is going to get hit, or one of your vendors is going to get hit. That's just the reality, especially in healthcare. Healthcare is unique in ransomware because ransomware groups, for the most part, don't target the way we traditionally talk about targeting. So when we talk about targeting in ransomware, or when we talk about targeting generally, what we're saying is, if you're a nation state, you say, oh, I want to go after the aerospace industry in the US, and then everybody goes and tries to research how, the paid hackers go and try and figure out how to research and how to get into the aerospace industry in the US. Ransomware, for the most part, targets vulnerabilities, whether it's vulnerable people or vulnerable systems, except for healthcare. Healthcare is the one sector that they really like to go after because they know how valuable patient data is. They know they are more likely to get paid a ransom, even though, on average, healthcare providers are less likely to pay ransom than other sectors. But in their stupid little minds, they know that they are more likely to get paid if they hit a healthcare provider. And they at least know if they hit the right kind of healthcare provider, especially a hospital, they're going to get a whole lot of attention, and that is part of the success of ransomware. Ransomware is the only crime that I'm aware of that has its own public relations arm. One of the reasons that ransomware continues to be so successful is every ransomware actor goes out and brags about everybody that they hit. They post that on their data leak sites, and if it's a big enough victim, it gets attention in the papers, or it gets attention on the nightly news. At the very least, it gets attention on Twitter. And they like that. They like the fact that they get attention. The only equivalent I've ever seen to what ransomware actors do when they hit somebody is, my parents grew up in a small town in Pennsylvania, Windber, it's over near Johnstown, which means I'm very, very unhappy about Sunday's game against the Colts. Just throwing that out there. And a couple years ago, a local guy robbed the sheets and then went on his Facebook page, his public Facebook page, and bragged about the money that he stole from the sheets, which then the cops used to pick him up and arrest him. So guys that knock over sheets and people that take down multi-billion-dollar healthcare companies are basically the only two people that brag about their crimes in a way that everybody can see. There is this quote that is way overused in cybersecurity, but it's still true, and it's from Mike Tyson. Everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face. And ransomware is the ultimate punch in the face. Most organizations think they're ready for a ransomware attack. Question is, are you really? Have you tested your plan? Have you thought about the recovery process? And have you thought about the type of monkey wrenches that'll kind of be thrown in and what the ransomware actor will be doing, because they're going to be in your network trying to fight you as you're trying to recover. And so what I tell people is you've got to build a ransomware incident response plan, and you have to take into account all of the things that the ransomware actor will try and do to counter it, and account for all the things that can possibly go wrong in your attack. I don't know if you all saw the news, but last week, HIPAA issued a $250,000 fine against a healthcare provider, a relatively small one. I will not mention their name because they've already had a bad enough year. But this healthcare provider got hit with ransomware, and their data was leaked, so they filed a complaint because they didn't pay the ransom, and a whole bunch of patient data was leaked online, and so now they've got, on top of all of the recovery costs, they have this $200,000 fine from HHS. And one of the first things that HHS mentioned as recommendation for them, and this applies to everybody, and it ties in nicely to everything I've been hearing so far today in the talks, is knowing where your data is super important, knowing how your data is secured. And we're going to get more into that in a minute, but I'm going to get this out of the way now because my marketing department really, really hates this analogy, but you'll remember it. So I apologize if anybody from my marketing department is listening. It's not enough to protect your data in your network, in your cloud. You also have to know how your data is being protected in your partners and your vendors and your cloud. So think of it like an STD. It's not enough to know who you've slept with, but you have to know who all of your partners have slept with. Now you have to know, when you're doing your data governance, how all your partners and vendors are securing their data. This is the boring part of the talk, but I think it's an important part to understand. So now's a good time to go to the bathroom, get a drink. If you want another pretzel or a cookie, I completely understand. But I do think that it's something you all need to understand. This is the way a modern ransomware attack works. And I think it's also important to understand that a modern ransomware attack is not a single threat actor carrying out this attack. Ransomware is a complex ecosystem with a lot of different threat actors involved. And almost every ransomware attack that I see involves at least 3 different threat actors. On your left, you have your initial access brokers. Those are the people who gain access to the network. And they generally do that through phishing, credential reuse, exploitation, third party, so they get into one network and use that access to jump into another network, social engineering, and insider threat. Insider threat, relatively small, but it is something ransomware actors are interested in. Once the initial access broker has access, they have to turn that over to a ransomware operator. Now, some of them have really close relationships and they hand it over and get paid. Others don't. Others are freelance. And so there are these marketplaces where they sell their access. So they post in one of the underground forums, hey, I have access to a manufacturing plant in Knoxville, Tennessee. It has $3 billion in revenue and I have admin access. How much money are you going to give me for that initial access? And then the ransomware operators bid on that, pay for it, and then carry out the attack. That period of time can take either days or weeks, depending on the reputation of the initial access broker, the type of access, and where the victim is located. Once the ransomware operator is in the network, the system works roughly the same way. The process really works the same way. There's a lot of script sharing between the different ransomware groups, and so everybody uses kind of the same tools. But basically, once the ransomware operator is in the network, they use these tools basically to get admin access, get on your domain controller, figure out what files to steal, and then if they're going to encrypt, then start planning out the encryption process. The part on the left, the initial access broker, takes about 79 minutes on average. Unless you're one of like the 60% of networks out there that gives everybody in the network local admin access, then it's like 5 minutes. Then it can be, depending on how long it takes and the relationship, the initial access broker, it can either, they can immediately hand it off, or it can be a couple weeks to a month before they hand off the network. Once the ransomware operator is in your network, on average right now, it takes about 5 days for the ransomware operator, once they land in the network, to when they've executed their attack, whatever that attack is going to be. Sometimes we see longer, sometimes very short, but on average you have 5 days. But according to Microsoft, within 24 hours, they're sitting on your domain controller once they're in your network. And once they're on the domain controller, it is a lot harder to get them off. And that's obviously a problem, because what they do is they create a bunch of new admin accounts, they implant a bunch of backdoors, et cetera, so it's much more difficult to get them off. So you do not have a lot of time to stop the ransomware actor once he's in your network. And then once the ransomware operation happens, whatever happens, they hand it over to whoever runs the actual ransomware as a service operation, and they generally handle the negotiation, take the payment, post the files if you're not going to pay, et cetera. So that's a broad overview of how a modern ransomware attack works. 50 minutes is not enough time. 35 minutes and 7 seconds is not enough time to go through everything needed to build a good IR plan. But I want to give you some of the basics, some of the things that you can think about. And these are the things that we are going to talk about today: information sharing, multi-factor authentication, info stealers, patching, backups and encryption, and tabletop exercises. You'll notice most of the things that we talk about are going to be in that initial access broker phase. Because if you can stop the initial access broker, you don't have to worry about the rest of it. And so that's really where I like people to concentrate on trying to stop the ransomware attack. And then if you can't, working on recovering. So this has actually already been talked about today, and I'm glad, because it makes my job easier. When we talk about trying to stop a ransomware attack, we're really talking about the three basics. You have to have good identity management, good asset management, and good data management. And if I'd been given this talk 20 years ago, I would have told you had to do the same thing. And we still haven't figured this out. Like, if you do these three things really well, it is so much harder for a ransomware actor to get into your network because it's harder for the initial access broker to get into your network. But it's hard to do these three things really well. Obviously, 20 years later, it still wouldn't be relevant. But those are kind of the basic things that you need to do as part of a security program in order to protect yourself. So what does that mean? Identity management is, do you know who should be logging into your network? Do you know where they should be logging in from? And what systems should they be talking to? And then asset management, do you know what all systems you have, both in your network and in your cloud? And what software is running on those systems? And then data management, again, we talked about this briefly. Where is your data? How's it being secured locally and in the cloud and with your partners and vendors? And more basic than that even, what data do your vendors have? Our internal security team at Recorded Future have been going through this data governance exercise this year, and it's surprisingly hard to find out if you're starting from scratch, what data all of your vendors have. One, you first of all have to get a list of all your vendors, and then find out what they are. And most security teams, most compliance teams, really haven't put in a data requirement process for new vendors so that information isn't always readily available, and it's a matter of going back and backtracking and doing it. But when you are doing security, when you are doing data governance, one of the things you have to think about is, hey, can we make that part of the process of onboarding new vendors? Is what data will they have and how's it being secured? So let's start with multi-factor authentication. I think you all know what multi-factor authentication is, so I'm not going to read all that text to you. That screenshot is from a video called YMFA, based on the YMCA song. I will not sing that for you, but you can find it on YouTube somewhere. But multi-factor authentication does stop a lot of these kind of attacks, because the identity theft, or not identity theft, but stolen creds are involved in almost 86% of data breaches every year. Multi-factor authentication is a good panacea for stopping a lot of those, although not always, because there's a little more complexity to it, because sometimes they don't just sell the creds, but they also sell the token, the 30-day cookie that you may have for your MFA. So you need a little bit more than just MFA, but MFA is a really good start. So you want to have multi-factor authentication in place. I feel like I lost a slide here. Okay. You also need to have backups and encryption. You need to have backups of all of your data. Backups are not going to stop a ransomware attack. But what backups will do is they give you options. Now, in a world where almost every ransomware attack these days involves data theft, it lessens your options a little bit, because publishing your data is a big part of the extortion process. But having backups does at least give you options as far as recovery goes, but those backups have to be done correctly. So we always recommend the 3-2-1 rule, 3 copies of your data on at least 2 different types of media, at least one of those pieces of media being, if not offline, at least something that can't be overwritten. That can be as simple as a tape backup, but it could be but it could be other types of media that just can't be overwritten. So how is your data currently backed up? How is the data encrypted? If it's encrypted at rest, that makes it harder for the ransomware actor, again, unless you give everybody in your network local admin access, in which case they can just unencrypt the data before they steal it. And then again, going back to that data governance, what is sensitive data is in your network, and how is it encrypted? One of the things that we like to focus on for understanding your recovery process is tabletop exercises. You have to plan that your defenses are going to fail. Because they failed for so many other companies, that's just the reality. And so I really encourage tabletop exercises as a way to fully understand how effective your process is, how effective your ransomware incident response is, because it allows you to do a few things. One, you can understand what the gaps in your knowledge are. We all think we know how we'll respond in the event of an attack, but maybe we don't. Maybe we're wrong about how other departments will work. But it also allows you to get other parts of your organization involved. Bring in the parts that are going to be necessary, because when there's a ransomware attack, it's all hands on deck, and it gives you a chance to bring those other people in. And these people may be tangentially aware. Everybody knows ransomware is bad, but they don't always know necessarily how bad it is. I was working with a small healthcare provider that unfortunately had been hit by ransomware, and they had been planning, they had done some planning for it, and a bigger hospital over near them had gotten hit with ransomware, and it took that hospital 4 days to recover. So when the CISO asked that security team how long it would take that hospital to recover, they said the same thing, 4 days, maybe 5. It took them 4 weeks because what they hadn't counted on is their backups were great for a single machine. It wasn't great for 2,000 machines. And trying to restore all of the devices that needed to be restored took so much longer than they anticipated. But, and that's part of this. So it allows you to do a dry run of your attack response and know, hey, we're going to have the PR team in here. We'll probably have to have human resources in. We'll certainly have to have our legal team, and what vendors will we need to bring in? Bring all of your vendors in to your tabletop exercises. If nothing else, you get a free lunch out of it, because the vendors will fall all over themselves to buy the better lunch. But you're probably going to call on them if you have a ransomware attack, and you want to make sure that you can. You want to make sure they're going to be there and they're going to be responsive. And it allows you to discover flaws in your incident response process before you have to do it. I've seen this time and time again, where the security team will assume that the desktop team will do something in the event of a ransomware attack, and the desktop team will say, well, no, that's not our responsibility. We didn't know that. Great, now let's fix that. And that allows you to keep doing this, and it builds essentially a tabletop tiger team that you all can provide updates to. And of course, all of this requires leadership to be there. You need to have somebody with a C in their name, in their title, just to be clear, sitting in on these tabletop exercises so they fully understand the impact, fully understand what it's going to cost the organization to go through this recovery process, and so that there's somebody answerable as you go through and make the updates and continue to make adjustments to the plan. So you've gone through all this, and then you get hit by a ransomware attack. What do? First thing is speed. Assuming the attack has been contained, you have to act quickly. Obviously, the faster you can contain an attack, the faster you can stop it. You have to move fast because you want to fully understand the damage, but you also want to make sure that you get the ransomware actor out of your network as quickly as possible. So you want to do your incident response and your disaster recovery, and likely you want to do those things simultaneously, right? Because yes, you want to start figuring out how you're going to recover, but you can't recover until you're sure that that threat actor is not going to get back in. One of the things that I tell people is, while your first instinct may be to start the recovery process, don't do that until you fully understand how they got in and that you can make sure that they can't get back in, or worse, that they're not still in. I have seen so many incident responses where they thought they kicked the ransomware actor out and they hadn't. The ransomware actor is sitting on their mail server reading all of the updates, which, completely separate side note here, make sure your out-of-band communication plan is in place before the incident response happens. Because too many times I see the more advanced ransomware actor sitting on your mail server, sitting in your Slack, reading all of your comments, following along with what you're doing because you thought you kicked them out of the network and you didn't. So have your out-of-band, switch to your out-of-band, occasionally test your out-of-band. So there are companies you can buy that will handle out-of-band access for you, but you can do something as simple as a WhatsApp or a Signal group, right? As long as you keep that updated and you keep that process tested, and you may have already an emergency out-of-band system set up, and you can create a subgroup of that just for ransomware incident response. Again, you want that done, though, before the attack. If you don't have an incident response retainer with a third party, get one now. Although if you have cyber insurance, they likely will have that in place for you. But that, again, is another thing to find out now, not find out after the attack. So reach out to your cyber insurance company when you're talking to all your other vendors. Find out what they will provide for you. Find out what capabilities they give you and don't give you, because then you can plan for what else you need. But if you do have a third-party incident, or if you don't have one and it's not provided by your cyber insurance company, get one now, because the last thing you want to do in the middle of a ransomware attack is have to worry about filling out paperwork and getting lawyers involved to redline things and so on and so forth. So you want to have that. There is nothing wrong with admitting that you are in over your head. Hopefully this is the first time you've been hit with a ransomware attack. It's okay to be overwhelmed and bring them in. That's why I said, invite all of your vendors to your tabletop exercise so that they know they may get that call when your worst day happens. You want them there. You want to bring in your third-party IR as soon as possible. You want to bring in your vendors as soon as possible. And you want to know who is going to be the response captain, who's going to be the person in charge of everything. You probably want it to be you. You might not be the best person because you may be knee-deep in working on recovery, but you need somebody that you can trust who's going to be level-headed, who can organize all the different groups that are out there that are going to be competing for attention while you're going through the incident response, that's going to make sure everybody gets up. But you want somebody within your organization to coordinate with all the vendors, with all the people working, and so on. You want to have that in place ahead of time. You're going to need your legal team. I've already mentioned that. They also are likely going to want to bring in outside counsel. Every ransomware attack that I've seen, there's been an outside counsel involved as well. And again, this may be provided by your insurance company, may not. That's one of those things where you'll have to, where you'll kind of have to talk to them about and find out kind of what they provide and don't. But there are a whole lot of reasons why you're going to want both your in-house counsel and out-house counsel involved in this attack to make sure you do everything correctly, to make sure you're in compliance with everything, and to make sure you understand what's going to be coming going forward. So keep your lawyers involved, both with your tabletop exercise and as part of your recovery plan. And your cyber insurance. Again, reach out to them early and often and find out what they cover, what they don't. Many cyber insurance companies will no longer pay a ransom. They got a whole lot of heat for that. And so they don't want to pay a ransom. And, but they're going to have a lot of resources for you to help you go through the recovery process. So they will provide a number of services for you in addition to in addition to probably providing a third-party service. They'll likely provide a ransomware negotiator. You are going to want to negotiate with the ransomware actors even if you have no intention of paying a ransom, because the ransomware actors are stupid and they will give up a whole lot of information. And I keep saying that the ransomware actors are stupid, and I know that that doesn't jibe with the sort of terribleness we see from ransomware groups. I should be clear, ransomware actors are really good at one thing: carrying out ransomware attacks. They are really bad at everything else. I have a story that I've heard from a ransomware negotiator that kind of shows this. So a lot of respect for this person. She is really, really good at what she does. But she was in a really tight negotiation, and the ransomware actor was just not budging, not giving them any time so that they could assess the network, assess what's going on, figure out what they had to do. He wanted his ransom paid immediately, or he was going to release all the files. So what she did was, and she wasn't proud of this, but it worked. She played the woman card. She said, I know you really want this information, you want it now, but my husband's going to be home soon, and if he doesn't have dinner on the table waiting for him when I get home, he gets really mad. The ransomware actor's tone changed instantly. No problem, I'll give you 24 hours. Getting dinner for your husband is super important. And it worked. It bought them another 24 hours for them to assess the situation, and they didn't have to pay a ransom. When the Lockbit ransomware was disrupted earlier this year, NCA, the British law enforcement people, found 200 crypto wallets still sitting on the server. Because as good as Lockbit was as running a ransomware service, he couldn't figure out how to launder his money. So they recovered tens of millions of dollars just sitting in crypto wallets on servers because, now, admittedly, it is very hard to open a laundromat or a mattress store in downtown St. Petersburg. I get that. But you'd think with all that money, you'd figure out how to reach out to somebody who, you'd figure out how to reach out to somebody who could help you with that. Bribe a government official or something. But they were able to recover a bunch of the ransom that was paid to him because the guy didn't know how to do that next step. Scattered Spider has terrorized a bunch of organizations. You may remember Scattered Spider because they were famous for knocking out 2 casinos in Vegas last year. The leader of Scattered Spider was arrested in Spain earlier this year because his name was Tyler something or another, and his handle on the Telegram channel that they used to communicate was Tyler B. So it was real easy for law enforcement to make that connection. The point is, you want to have a negotiator because the negotiator is, and I know it's a really long way to get back to a point, but I promise I'm there. The negotiator understands how these people think and has probably worked with a lot of them before and will buy you time. You do not want to do your own negotiation with these guys because you're generally too invested in it. I was helping out with a ransomware incident a couple of years ago, and the CEO of the company he was like, no, I negotiate multi-million-dollar deals all the time. I can handle the negotiation. I'm like, well, you're the CEO. You really shouldn't be doing this. But he was really mad, and he wanted to do it. And of course, the ransomware actor wasn't budging, didn't like the attitude of the CEO. And so the CEO in the little chat program, which was the other thing, the CEO was used to negotiating in person or over the phone. The ransomware actors only used their little chat windows. Let out just a string of expletives. And the jagoff on the other side of the screen had the nerve to say, excuse me, sir, I've been nothing but professional with you. If you can't treat me with the same level of respect, then we're going to just end the negotiations. So I finally pulled the CEO away and let the insurance company bring in a negotiator to help them out with this. And you know, again, your insurance company can provide a lot of this for you. They are there to help you. Likely you're paying a lot more money in premiums than you were a couple of years ago for your cyber insurance. So if you do get hit, definitely take advantage of that. So everything that we've talked about when it comes to putting together a ransomware incident response plan requires continuous review and update. A tabletop exercise is not a one-time thing. You have the tabletop exercise and then you keep updating, and ideally you have an annual tabletop exercise. Ideally you have twice a year, but getting everybody together I know is really tough. And so if you can at least do an annual one and then keep doing updates, then you can make sure that you have the most current information, which, by the way, whenever you get an updated version of your ransomware incident response plan, maybe print it out and store it somewhere so it doesn't accidentally get encrypted. But make sure you're making adjustments to the plan. Make sure as people feed in new information, you're making those changes. And you know, because your organization is going to change over time. How it works is going to change over time. Who the people you contact are going to change over time. So make sure you're constantly doing those updates and use that use these as the ability to refine and update your plan. Also, and this is the final point, make sure you're taking care of your people. Make sure that you've planned for that. 60% of security professionals leave after a ransomware attack. And these are not the people you want to leave, because these are now the hardened people that know that, you know, the ones that have seen some stuff, and you want them around, you want them working on your security, but they're burnt out, man, because when you get hit with ransomware, you're on for most of the day, for weeks, if not months at a time. So it is really easy for your people to burn out. And they want to be there, right? I mean, that's in security, that's what we do. We want to be there. We want to make the organization safe. We want to keep all the employees safe, so we don't want to go home. We want to be there for you. So make sure you're thinking about how you're going to take care of your people. Up to and including forcing them to go home after a reasonable amount of time. Or, hey, can we book a block of hotel rooms nearby so maybe they don't want to go home, but at least go and let them get a good night's sleep. Make sure that you're buying the good food for them. And I know, fat guy making 2 food comments in the same presentation, big surprise. But really, nobody wants cold pizza for 3 meals a day. Make sure if you're feeding everybody that you're varying up the meals. Make sure that you're getting the drinks that everybody likes. Making sure that they, while they're working their tails off for you, make sure that you are taking care of them, because you're going to want them back after this, because they're going to know more about how to protect your network, and they're going to know more about keeping you safe, and ultimately that's what we all want. And I want to thank you all very much for your time today and inviting me. According to this clock, I have 10 minutes left. So I'm going to happily take questions. And if there are no questions, I have a Kenny Rogers karaoke app on my phone, and I will sing my rendition of The Gambler, which is terrible. So hopefully y'all have some questions for me.
We're going to need you to prove that, by the way.
on a warm summer's evening on a train bound for nowhere.
So thanks so much, Alan, for coming. For those that don't know, Alan's the ransomware sommelier. He's got a really excellent book on ransomware called Ransomware, Understand, Prevent, Recover. I think it's a free ebook, I think, on the Recorded Future website.
Yeah, there's a PDF copy, or you can spend way too much money and buy it on Amazon, but get the free copy.
Don't be fooled. It is an actual comprehensive resource on the ransomware topic that Alan's just scratched the surface of. And that's how we became aware of Alan's work. And he was actually on our podcast this season, I think. So we're very grateful for your expertise. Anyway, I want to get that out. If you like what you heard, the book is amazing.
Thank you.
Hi, right here.
Alan.
Right.
To your left.
Oh, I'm sorry. What's that? Oh, sorry.
Hey, so I think one of the very common, things that we hear is, right, lowest hanging fruit. So with your experience, is there anything that a company can do to prevent someone who is looking for a victim, right, a ransomware, someone who would fall? Is there something that a company can do to reduce their risk? So you mentioned a tabletop exercise. If I publish that on my website, do you think that will reduce the amount of attacks on me? Is there anything you can think of with your experience that a company can do to reduce their risk?
So the two big things that I tell people to do is monitor for leaked credentials and patch things that the ransomware actors exploit, right? And the way to make that easier on yourself, there are two services that I love that are completely free. Free, and then one has a paid version. But Have I Been Pwned by Troy Hunt will provide you a list of email addresses in your organization that have been listed on Underground Forums websites, right? They'll send you an email every time a new one appears. Change those credentials. Because, again, bad guys love using leaked credentials. And so if you can get those credentials changed quickly, you can stop that attack vector. The other thing is CISA has a Kev list. So I can stand up here and I can tell you, patch all the things, but there are going to be 50,000 vulnerabilities released this year. You cannot realistically patch all 50,000 or whatever are relevant to your network in a timely manner. You just can't, right? Nobody has a big enough vulnerability management team. Even the government doesn't have a big enough vulnerability management team. Large banks don't have big enough vulnerability management teams. But CISA has a KEV list, that's KEV, known exploited vulnerabilities. And what that does is it reduces your attack surface. It reduces the things you need to prioritize patching from 50,000 to 10, right? These are the things that the cyber criminals are exploiting now. Go ahead and prioritize patching those. Because most ransomware groups, they're not using 0 days, they're not doing anything fancy. There are a few exceptions, but if you want to reduce most ransomware attacks, doing those two things, monitoring for leaked credentials and forcing password changes, and patching the things that ransomware actors are exploiting, prioritizing patching the things that ransomware actors are exploiting, those two things reduce your attack surface significantly for ransomware actors. And they're free, which is nice. Most things aren't free.
Thanks for the presentation. I'm Walter Haydock, founder of Stackware.
Hi.
In a previous life, I worked in counterterrorism, and the US government has a stated policy of not paying ransoms to kidnappers. It gets a little blurry because sometimes private individuals will pay, but there is evidence that US citizens are less likely to be kidnapped. So the parallel here is, do you have any experience or data with organizations that affirmatively say, hey, attention ransomware gangs, we don't pay ransoms? Have you ever seen that, and has it been effective?
It's not effective. So yes, North Carolina, Florida, and I think now Texas have all instituted rules that public sector entities will not be allowed to pay a ransom. And they've made that very well known, and The people in Congress, in the State House, very publicly said, we're doing this so that ransomware actors won't hit public sector entities in these, in our state. Ransomware attacks against public sector entities in those states went up in every case. The ransomware actors assume you are lying because they are lying bastards, and so they assume everybody is a lying bastard. So if that is your stated opinion, they think you're going to try and find a way around that. And I mean, honestly, we have seen people who paid ransoms in very shady ways to avoid having to report things, not from those 3 states, but just in general. And so the ransomware actors actually have a lot of ammunition to believe that people will do shady things. So the one good analogy that we have is in 1991, Italy instituted a ban on ransom payments to stop the flow of kidnappings that were happening, which is weird. I never thought when I got into ransomware research I'd have to research kidnappings in Italy in the 1970s and 80s, but I did. The problem with the ban in Italy, the Italian government will tout it as a huge success, but the problem with the ban in Italy is by 1991, kidnappings had already dropped off significantly in Italy. So yes, they went down, but they went from like 6 to 4 instead of, at the height in the early 80s when there were 50 or 60 kidnappings a year. They'd already been dropping. I do think that if the US were to institute because the US is the largest target by far for ransomware groups, because we have more companies than any other country in the world, and so the US gets hit more often. I do think if the US were to institute a ransomware payment ban, it would be a bad idea, but it would probably be the least bad option available to us, because then, yeah, there are going to be companies that figure out ways around it and find ways to avoid it. Oh, look, we have a subsidiary in the Seychelles. That subsidiary will pay, or something like that. And I swear, and I know this is probably really bad to say in Texas, I swear sometimes when I start talking about ransomware and companies, I sound like a socialist. I'm not. But I've just seen companies do so many shady things to avoid having to admit they paid a ransom. But it might work because it'll reduce the number of ransom overall, and that's one of the things we have to do, right? Taking out the ransomware bad guys is good. Arrests where we can, sanctions where we can. And unfortunately, nobody's adopted my drone strikes for ransomware actors program yet. I'm still hoping. But we have to do that. Law enforcement has to do their job, but we have to figure out how to prevent them from getting paid. And a ban might be that. I know in the UK, what they're proposing is essentially a ransomware license. So if you get hit with ransomware and you decide you have to pay, you have to tell the UK government, explain the situation, they do a quick assessment, and then you have to report every detail of the transaction to them so they can track where the cryptocurrency is going, track the crypto miners it goes, not the crypto miners, the crypto exchanges it goes through and the mixing that it goes through, so they can maybe claw it back or maybe issue additional sanctions. I actually like that model a little bit more because then I don't have to worry about like a small rural hospital that is in really bad shape not being able to pay a ransom. They can, but at least we can track the transaction, which right now, surprisingly little about a ransomware attack or a ransomware payment has to be reported. There are certain sectors where it definitely does, but for the most part, it really doesn't, and that makes it really hard for governments to track and understand how big the problem is.
Really, really interesting session over here.
Thank you.
Right here.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you for the session. My question is about AI use by the attackers and how that could either, have you seen that? Is there potential for that? How that could potentially tip the balance on the threat and risk landscape? So
there are really 2 areas where we see AI right now with the ransomware groups, and they're both in the initial access broker part. We see it in the dudes that build the phishing emails. they rely very heavily on AI to build out their phishing emails, because they can generate a lot more phishing emails a lot faster that avoid detection. But then we're also starting to see it. So we've seen Scattered Spider and other Western groups engage in social engineering. We haven't seen a lot of Russian groups try it. But now with AI voice changing, we are starting to see some of the Russian-based ransomware initial access brokers try to use that for social engineering. So those are really the two ways. We haven't seen it inside the, we haven't seen it inside of an actual ransomware operation yet, just with the initial access phase.
I think that's all the time we have. Alan,
Okay.
thank you so much.
No problem. Thank you all.